Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. You can find our perspectives at fff.org. I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host of the Libertarian Angle, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, good to see you again.
Great to see you and to be joined by our viewers and listeners. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah, I thought we would discuss today a burning issue of the times. I mean, we've discussed immigration a number of times, but it's, of course, back in the news, as it always is because it's always under perpetual crisis. But this specifically deals with Trump's rescission of the so-called DACA campaign, the Dreamer campaign, where President Obama decided to exempt an entire class of people from the enforcement of immigration laws, and those people are children of foreigners who were brought here illegally when they were tots, and so they've been here 20 years or so. They're still not American citizens. They're here illegally, but Obama said, well, it would be harsh and unjust to force them to go back to their country, so he established a program where people could go and register and become so-called dreamers, which would effectively immunize them in case they got picked up by the immigration police. It would immunize them from being repatriated back to their home countries. Donald Trump is come into office and, pursuant to his political promises, announced a rescission of the program. Says he's going to, well, not do it immediately, but maybe have a 6-month time lag, and said that Congress can do something about it if they want to. So, Richard, what do you think about what's going on here?
Well, I think that it's been interesting to read the views of the media and the pundits on this, because we have a strange situation. Conservatives have often been objecting over the last 8 years to the former President Obama's insistence that he has a pen and a telephone, by which he meant that if Congress, which was controlled for most of his administration by the Republicans, if Congress would not pass a law for him to sign, he would use all power that he interpreted to belong to the executive branch of the government to do what he considered right and necessary. So therefore, he then institutes this Dreamer executive order, exempting the children of those who have crossed into the United States illegally under existing law, and now said that they will now be able to stay in the United States. The Republicans were very upset about this, and because this was a violation of the division of powers, where legislation begins, how the procedures should be followed. This was like an imperial presidency, right? Democratic despotism. So now Trump comes along, and he says, I'm basically I'm rescinding this and throwing it back into the hands of the Republicans in Congress, or the Congress as a whole, to have to decide what to do with the legislation. In fact, this is exactly what he should do. This is separate from the issue of the immigrants. We're talking about constitutionally. This is what he should do. The President Obama, overextended his authority with another executive order, which became a series of such acts. And it is the responsibility of the Congress to decide such things as what is the law of the land, and whether it is wise or unwise to determine immigration laws of various types. Conservatives, in many cases, have been sort of divided in this about how this should be handled or what should be done. But we also see the same type of ambiguity and confusion on the people of the left. Suddenly, the left, that is the progressives, the liberal Democrats, are up in arms that he overthrows this, when he basically says, I don't have this executive authority, and throws it back in the hands of Congress. And they say, but wait a minute, you're overthrowing a law. Well, it wasn't a law. It was a president by an arbitrary decree saying that this was going to be the status of people. So both the left and the right are in sort of an ambiguity of what to do, how to do, what's right, what's wrong. The issue is that constitutionally, Trump probably has done the right thing. It should be left up to Congress to determine the immigration laws of the United States. So now it's up to the hands of Congress. Now, what should Congress do? Okay, he's foregone, at least in this one instance, arbitrary executive authority. So what should Congress do? And that requires us to think what should be the immigration policy of the United States. Now, classical liberals and libertarians have often argued that freedom is indivisible. It's freedom not only just to live your own life as you choose, to keep the fruits of your own labor, to freely associate with others, to be secure in your property. That in the tradition of classical liberalism and libertarian thought over, let's say, the last 250 years, an equally important premise in this idea of the independence and freedom of the individual is his right to move and reside and live and work where he chooses. Therefore, from the libertarian or strictly classical liberal perspective, the individual has a freedom of migration. As long as he is not doing a criminal act, he is free to live where he wants, associate with whom he wants, work for whom he wants, and so on. So now what should Congress do? It should radically revise the immigration laws of the United States. It is probably too much to expect in the political temper of today to see an abolition of immigration restrictions. But at a minimum, one way of alleviating this violation of the right of the individual to live and peacefully work and interact where he wants and with whom he wants, at a minimum, the Congress should basically say these young people who were brought to the United States as little children, perhaps illegally by their parents, but no other life than that in the United States. Many of them may speak only English, or they might now have Spanish as their second language, under the presumption that many of these are from Latin America originally. Some of them may not even know Spanish. You're going to send someone back to Argentina who may not, or Mexico, or Nicaragua, or wherever, Ecuador, who doesn't even understand Spanish. They've made roots here. They've grown up here. They've established already, some of them, careers and professions. They've made families here. So at a minimum morality, it would be appropriate to say these people are absolutely and positively exempt from any deportation. That would at least be, on a pragmatic level, the first stepping stone to a radical revision of the immigration laws, always and totally towards a policy of free movement of people and free migration, which should remain the point on the horizon towards which any libertarian or classical liberal believes public policy should be moving.
Yeah, you bring up two good points. One is with respect to the immigration system itself, and then the manner in which laws are interpreted and enforced in the United States. Let me address the latter point first. There's an old principle called the rule of law versus the rule of men. And what it means is that when you have the rule of law, that people only have to answer to the law itself. They don't have to worry about a dictator saying this is what you should do today and this is what you should do tomorrow, or just making up crimes as he goes along. That the idea is, no, through a legislative process, the legislative branch of the government enacts a law, and then everybody knows what that law is, and it's supposed to be applied across the board. The rule of men is where you have a dictator just arbitrarily saying, well, this is what you can do and what you can't do. There's no such thing as a law passed by Congress. The decree of the dictator is the law. I mean, a good example of this was under the Pinochet dictatorship, where he would issue a decree and it immediately became what was known as a decree law, because he was the law. That's called the rule of men. And that's the essence of tyranny. a necessary prerequisite, although not a sufficient prerequisite, but a necessary prerequisite for a free society is the rule of law. And so here you have this immigration law that's been enacted that says anybody who enters the United States without permission is violating the law. They're a criminal. And so that's the law enacted by Congress. That's the law, by the way, that liberals and conservatives both support. So all of a sudden Obama comes in and says, well, it's cruel, it's harsh, it's unjust. Look what it's doing to this entire class of people that were brought here as children. I'm going to unilaterally decide to carve out an exception here. That is what's called the rule of men. He's acting as a dictator, saying, I'm not going to comply with this law enacted by Congress. I in my wisdom are going to decide not to enforce the law against entire groups of people. And they become the privileged class, the ones that the dictator, whether he's elected or not, happens to favor. Now, so Trump's got a point. He comes in and says, look, this is the law. Anybody who enters the United States illegally is violating the law. We may not like the law, but that's the law. Now, Richard, goes now moving over to the second point about immigration laws. As I pointed out, this is the law that they favor, both liberals and conservatives. The people that come in here illegally are law violators. They need to be repatriated. And now all of a sudden, the liberals are lamenting the consequences of their very own law. Now, as you point out, Congress could, I think, really essentially decree an amnesty. I mean, I think that's what they would be doing. Essentially pardoning everybody here that came in as a child as part of this DREAM program. But notice that it would still keep in place the law. It would still keep saying that anybody here that's brought in that's 2 years old, 3 years old, and is caught a couple of months later, he's illegal. He's subject to being deported. I mean, how do you craft a law that says, well, anybody enters the United States illegally will be deported unless you come in at 2 years of age or 1 year of age and you stay here without getting caught for 19 years, in which case you're automatically, you get an out of jail free card. So it really goes to show you how this immigration law itself creates this chaos and this crisis. You and I have pointed out that this is a socialist system. It's a centrally planned system. So you end up with all these perversions. Now here's the central point. And this is the point that everyone needs to recognize. Immigration controls will never work. No matter what plan they come up with. I challenge anybody to come up with your favorite plan, your ideal plan for immigration controls. And I will tell you, it's not going to work. You're always going to have these kind of crises, this kind of chaos. There's really only one thing that works. I mean, you brought up the moral case, the freedom case for open borders. But there's also the practical case, Richard. And we libertarians own that high ground, both morally and on practical grounds. It's the only thing that works. It eliminates the chaos. It eliminates the crises. Just the free movements of people across borders, back and forth, retaining their citizenship. People don't have to become an American citizen any more than the million or so Americans who have retired in Mexico have to become Mexican citizens. People retain their citizenship. They travel back and forth. They open businesses. They get jobs. They visit. They tour. And that's the only thing that's going to finally work. It's what harmonizes the interests of people, where you don't have to be jerry-rigging the system all the time in order to eliminate the manifest injustices of the system.
If I can add to this last point about, the unworkability of it, I think that there's a sort of an analogy, and that is what happens when the government institutes a prohibition, when the participants, in the marketplace wish to freely associate and interact with each other. We all know the notorious and infamous case of a constitutional attempt to prohibit the production, sale, and purchase of alcohol in the United States. The Prohibition Amendment that ran from 1920 to 1933 until a new amendment to the Constitution overthrew the preceding one. The fact is, it did not prevent people from smuggling booze into the United States from Canada, from the Bahamas, for the rest of the Caribbean, across the Mexican border, and so on and so forth. If people have a desire to sell something, and there are people who are interested in buying it, and people are willing to pay the price and incur the cost, even with the legal prohibitions, restrictions, and penalties, guess what happens? The product crosses a border and is used by those who desire it. Immigration restrictions are just another form of prohibition. And what is its effect? If people desire to move and they value the potential gain greater than the risks of all the costs involved, dying in the desert, some smuggler leaving you to suffocate in a van in a Walmart parking lot in San Antonio, Texas, to be arrested and being put behind bars until the government deports you, the U.S. government deports you, et cetera, et cetera. If you believe that the value exceeds those potential costs to yourself and the well-being of your family, you're going to come to the United States. And if there are people who have a need and a desire, guided by market forces, to find minimally qualified and reasonably available labor in terms of the prices at which people will offer their labor services, the wages at which they're willing to work, people are going to come across the border to the United States. There will be people who will be willing to hire and associate with them, and it will not work. It's just another variation on the lessons of prohibition. The only solution to this is to accept the fact that people, when they find mutual gains from trade, will proceed to do it regardless of the penalty and the cost to themselves. Look at these people who are coming from Africa to the European Union across the Mediterranean. Thousands of them die of drowning attempting to get across the Mediterranean Sea. They're abused by those smugglers as well in ways that are probably far more cruel than even the ones who are smuggling people in from Mexico. But people do it. It's just the law of human association, which a government tries to restrain, prohibit, or redirect into the channels that the social engineers desire, social engineers of one type or another. There is only one solution at the end of the day, and that is liberty and freedom. Otherwise, you always have these both intended and terribly tragic unintended consequences.
It's a great point, and it really goes to show the hypocrisy of the left, because it is the immigration control, the illegal entry law, the denial of open movements of people, free movements of people, that is the root cause of all of this death and destruction. The so-called coyote, the transporter of illegal immigrants, where people are dying in the back of tractor trailers, or where people are crossing on the desert in Arizona and dying of thirst. This is a direct result of the law. None of that would exist in a regime where you did not have these immigration controls, these immigration laws that liberals support. This is a direct consequence, as you point out, of interventionism. You saw it in the alcohol regime. You see it in the drug war, where one intervention leads to another intervention and all the death and destruction, and people lose sight of the fact that it's interventionism itself that's producing the problem. Let me share with you a real life example. I was talking to a woman who works in a cafe who's clearly Hispanic, and I asked her how she came over here, and she said she came over 20 years ago, crossed in Arizona with a smuggler along with other groups of people, and she and her husband each paid $5,000 to the smugglers. And I said, where'd you get that kind of money? Because they were coming from like Nicaragua or something. And she said, oh, well, we had to borrow it from friends already in the U.S. And she said if we hadn't made it, we would have been deeply in debt. But she says we paid it all back. And she says, well, I'm an American citizen now. I asked her, are you an American citizen? And she said, yeah. And I said, prove it. I want to see your papers. And we both got a laugh out of it, because it really is irrelevant that, whether she's an American citizen or not, I don't care. I mean, she's over there cooking my food, and what do I care whether she really is legal or not? It's irrelevant. And that's what people lose sight of. In a regime of open borders, you're interacting with just human beings. You're not going to say, hey, I want to see if you're a citizen or not. It's irrelevant whether they're a citizen or not. And finally, Richard, the hypocrisy is not just limited to the left. You've also got the conservatives that are out there giving their speeches and on their stationery and websites with their favorite mantra of free markets, private property, and limited government. I mean, that's their favorite mantra. But when it comes to immigration controls, they throw that mantra out the window. I mean, what better example of private property and free markets in pursuit of happiness and economic liberty, all of which conservatives say they support, than immigration? Just the right to freely cross borders back and forth, the same way, by the way, we do domestically. People are free to cross state borders without encountering customs officials and immigration controllers. The same principle applies with respect to international borders. But unfortunately, conservatives can preach the mantra, but they just can't apply the principle.
Yeah, part of the problem that I sense many times among conservatives and Republicans to their objection to immigration is from where the immigrant is coming from. I doubt if conservatives and Republicans would be as resistant or opposing of greater immigration, forget about free immigration, but greater immigration, if it was predominantly from European countries.
Well, maybe it's Italy.
Yeah, there is often an attitude I've noticed in conversations with some. I don't want to imply all or a blanket generalization, but with some conservatives and Republicans, that they seem to think that if immigrants come from Latin America, or let's say Africa, but especially since of the large number from Latin America, brown people are somehow genetically programmed to vote liberal Democrat. So that if you allow all these brown people into the United States, it's sort of like in the eons of genetic evolution, they're going to want to be on welfare and vote in political paternalists. The idea that immigrants from Latin America could come to the United States searching to make a better life for themselves, to be self-supporting, to start their own businesses, to be able to accumulate a financial nest egg, which is not taxed away, so they and their family can have a better future than they would have had in the old country. In other words, the principles of individualism, self-reliance, family, thinking of the future. Conservatives are concerned with the erosion of religious values in the United States. Most, maybe not all, but most have come from a strong Roman Catholic tradition and heritage. The idea that people with those things would want to come to America like previous generations and just be free individuals in a free society and could be introduced to, let's put it in the broadest sense, conservative/libertarian freedom ideas, and that they might, when they're eligible to be citizens, to vote against big government, never seems to enter these people's minds. And I believe that that works against them viciously. Now, again, we've talked about this a number of times. If I can make one other point about this. I was just reading an essay from 1865 written by a man named Edwin Godkin. He's not a household name, but he actually was the founder and longtime editor through the second half of the 19th century of The Nation magazine. Now, we think, if you know of it, The Nation as a progressive left-wing publication. They fawn over Cuba and places like that. Well, when Godwin set up The Nation magazine in the 1860s, he did so as a classical liberal publication, and that's how he edited it through the second half of the 19th century. But the reason I bring him up is that in this essay from 1865, in the last year of the Civil War, he's talking about democracy in America, and he's challenging those who say, well, there are many causes that bring democracy down. And he says one of the criticisms made immigration. Now, this is a time America has open borders for all intents and purposes. Oh, the quality of American democracy is being weakened and undermined. Why? Because Germans and Irish are coming. Oh my gosh, those Irish, they drink and they're Pope worshippers, and they're Germans. Oh, they're just too weird for us. They are bringing their bad habits and their cultural baggage to America. It's the end of democracy and liberty in America. And he just lampoons this and shows the errors and stupidity of it. How is that any different than the criticisms and the arguments against immigrants today? You might say the difference, they look different because of the pigmentation of his skin color. But I can assure you, back in the mid-19th century, when Godkin was writing this piece, the concern was that it may be the same, more or less same pigmentation of a skin color, but how can they have a different culture, they have a different history, oh my gosh, it's all over. It's the same absurd and ridiculous rationales, because many Americans, if we ask where are they from, they are the descendants of maybe some of those Germans and Irish and Poles and Italians and Hungarians and Romanians. Let's go down the list. And at one point or another, each of those waves of earlier immigrants were challenged by Americans who were here already. Like, another wave of them, and it's the end of the world. No. What you have to understand is that there's no genetic tendency for collectivism or individualism, though there is a strong, in human nature, desire for our individuality. But to appreciate the institutional prerequisites for achieving your individuality, you must be educated. What social arrangement, what political order, what economic system will be most conducive for you to be able to have the freedom to develop and achieve what is individually possible for you? And that requires people to be explained the difference between capitalism versus collectivism, the free market versus central planning and the interventionist state. It's not embedded in where you came from or the color of your skin. And conservatives do great harm to the cause, to the extent that their conservatism includes those kind of values you talked about, Jacob: individual freedom, free enterprise, limited government. They do themselves no service in presuming that there is a class of people that they're defining in a particular way of appearance as unteachable in the principles of liberty.
Yeah, that was why I was laughing about Italy when you said that, people say, well, we just want European immigrants, or they make it look like they wouldn't oppose immigration if they were coming from Europe, but there was tremendous prejudice against the Italians when there was open borders, and against German, as you point out, against Irish. And let's face it, Richard, you hit the nail on the head, is that most people that come to the United States, they want to make money. They're not, we often hear, they're going to come and get on welfare. Give me a break. People come to this country because they want to make it big. They want to get wealthy. I mean, like the woman I was talking about, she's over there working in this cafe. I don't know what her husband does, but he's working. They're not on welfare. Why? Because they have children to raise, put through college. They want to make money. And so that's the kind of person that you inevitably attract in a regime of open borders. It's for a person to leave his country where he speaks his language, his culture, his family, relatives, friends, to move to another country where he's going to get insulted, abused, and harassed in the hopes of getting on welfare, very, very unlikely. But the important thing, Richard, from our standpoint is that, and I always tell libertarians this, we can never let the other side maneuver us into joining them. We have to keep adhering to our principles, that we adhere to libertarian principles, regardless of the cost here. If it results in higher taxes, we still adhere to those principles. And then we focus on ending the wrongdoing. Like people say, the terrorists will come and get us, which is nonsense. But focus on foreign interventionism. That's the root cause of the terrorist threat. So focus on getting rid of the foreign interventionism. Here domestically, we have domestic terrorists. They're free to cross state lines. They can go from one state to another state. Criminals, kidnappers, murderers can go from one state to another state. We don't destroy our freedom because of that risk. And the same applies with respect to internationally. And finally, Richard, people talk about how dangerous to let in foreigners in the United States. Americans travel overseas all the time. They go into these countries that people are afraid they might send their terrorists to us. Well, they seem to be getting along fine when people go and tour all kinds of countries. In fact, the only real unsafe countries are where the drug war is going, or where foreign interventionism is going, and people don't like Americans because of what their government's doing in those countries. But again, the real solution to this is the solution that works. And look what immigration controls bring us. They bring us a police state. We've got all those highway checkpoints along the border. We have warrantless searches of farms and ranches. We have roving border patrol checkpoints. We have a fence, eminent domain, now this big Berlin kind of wall. This is not what America should be standing for. This is totalitarianism. And it's all jerry-rigging. Nothing's going to work because immigration controls as a form of socialist central planning do not work. The only thing that works is open borders.
And I would just add one other thing, Jacob. Earlier you were referring to the smugglers who bring these illegal immigrants to the United States. Any real American knows it's pronounced coyote.
That's true, because I could get in trouble for speaking Spanish when English first should be spoken. In fact, it's funny you brought that up. A guy once told me that. He says, English only in America, and I said, well, does this mean that you would want to go out to California and visit the angels by going through the pass? And visit St. Francis too? And he says, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I presume that you don't want to be speaking Spanish and refer to El Paso and Los Angeles, the angels, and San Francisco, St. Francis. And he didn't think that was very funny. Anyway, Richard, on that note, we're out of time. So
until next time, and I want to just thank again our viewers and listeners for sharing some of their time with us. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you for your comments on YouTube when we post these things. We read them all. We try to respond to them, and so we're very grateful for y'all viewing and interacting with us. And again, you can come and access all our articles. Richard writes a weekly article for us every Monday. And I write a daily blog 5 days a week, and then we have other articles that we link to and that we publish. So come and visit us at fff.org. So Richard, until next week, see you then.
Until next time.